Hello and welcome to this video. In this section, we would be discussing about Kubernetes security, which is the role-based access control. So their security check is done in 3 steps, like the Kube API server, which picks up the commands which we are executing. It actually goes to a 3-step process for all the API call it runs through. So first we are authenticated. So authentication is not inbuilt in Kubernetes. You can have any third-party authentication like LDAP, or in case your cluster is running in Azure Cloud or AWS, you can use their IAM functionalities or Azure AD in case of Azure, and you can authenticate the user onto the cluster using the certificates token and the password and all that. And once the user is authenticated, it's designated as a valid user, then after that it comes to the role-based access section, wherein Kubernetes handles whether a particular user is authorized to do a set of action or not. So if I'm making an API call, I should be allowed to make that API call, or I should be denied to make that API call. So I, as a user, may be authenticated to get into the cluster, but I may not be authorized to do a set of actions on the cluster. So authentication is the first part, authorization is the second part. And once you have gotten into the cluster, you have got an admission inside the cluster, right? So how we execute this role-based access control, where you would limit the users, how would you limit the users, that we would be seeing in this particular section. So first, when we talk about role-based access control, till now most of the exercises we were doing in default namespace. And we, being an admin, had all the rights in our cluster. But if I have any other user, like a dev user named Dan, then I'll not give the entire cluster access to that particular user, right? I want dev access to be given to Dan user. His name is Dan and he belongs to dev team. So I'll create a namespace of dev team and I'll assign Dan user to the dev namespace. I'll create credentials for that particular user. I'll set the credentials and that namespace for using that particular user context. And then user is allowed inside that namespace, but what actions can dev do? That can be only defined by a specific role I assign to the user Dan. So in dev namespace, Dan can have a reader access, Dan can have a editable access on some specific resources. I can say Dan can only create a kind pod or kind deployment, but Dan can't create a PVC. I can restrict action on the resource level as well. So when we are creating role and we have a user to whom I want to assign that role, that is called as binding. I'm binding the user to a role. And that is the way we are limiting the access given or assigned to that particular user. So we have role and role binding. Role will define the set of rules which would be as additive rules or permissions which can be granted to the user which belongs to this particular role. And as soon as a user belongs to this role, he or she or a group of users will get access whatever is being granted inside this role. But when we just say role, it belongs to a namespace. And we would see that when we say cluster role, that role is applicable on the entire cluster. But when we say just kind as role, that should be attached to a single namespace. So how in dev namespace, I can have a role of a reader, and if I say Dan belongs to the reader role, then Dan will get access to dev namespace as a reader. So role binding, when we say, it is binding the permissions which are defined in the role either to a user or a set of users. So we have to understand who can do what in the cluster. So who can be a user, who can be a group of users, or who can be a process as well. Like my deployment takes the decision to scale with the help of horizontal pod autoscaler. I, being a user, I can execute the scale command with kubectl scale. When I execute that API call is executed from my user credentials. But when HPA is saying deployment, hey, you got to scale the number of replicas now, at that point in time, deployment is triggering the scale command. So deployment should have the authority to execute that command, and that is called as a service account. When one resource talks to another resource and give a set of instructions, that time also the authorization is checked for. So either I can be a user, either I can be belonging to a group like a managers group or a developers group or a testers group, and I can attach a role to the testers group. Then individually I need not attach to tester 1, tester 2, tester 3. Rather, I have a group of testers. I put them in a group and I attach the role to them. Or I have a service account which would be assigned to a particular resource, and whatever role is attached to the service account, that resource can perform those actions. So who can be a user, a group, or a service account? Same way, what can be a set of resources. It can be a set of resources on which I can perform the action. It can be a set of resources on which I can't perform the action. So there are some resources and there are some other resources. I would create a role which will grant me access to some of the resources, and I don't get access to the other resources in that. So if I specify I can execute actions on deployment, on volumes, then I would not be able to work with config map kind or secret kind or any other kind, but only work with deployment kind or a pod kind or a service kind or a PVC kind. So here, whatever you specify in the role, only those accesses are given, rest all are denied. So now role is created. Now binding has to be done. I can say that user 1 is belonging to role, or a set of group of users are belonging to this role, or a service account is belonging to this role. So my subject can be either one of them or all three of them who would be binding to this particular role. As soon as I bind, that particular set of actions which I have defined inside my role can be done by this user, or can be done by this set of users, or can be done by the resource to which we tie up this service account. So this is on the namespace level, a role or a role binding. In case I want to give access on the entire cluster level, a reader access, a editor access, a guy who can go ahead and delete the deployment, a guy who can delete the PV as well. So few of the things which we can do it on the cluster level, like I can grant permissions to other user. That is also a role on a cluster level, right? I can create a role. That is also a role on the cluster level. So when we say cluster level role, it is having a wide scope. Entire cluster wide scope is there. And when you grant permission, you don't grant permission on individual namespaces. Rather, it belongs to all the namespaces which are belonging to that particular cluster. So when you're defining permissions, that permission scope is entire cluster. So we have to be a bit cautious, because if we are granting a user a cluster-wide scope, he can go and execute those stuffs in any of the namespaces, just not one or two, rather entire cluster namespace. Same way how we did a binding of a subject, which was a user or a group or a service account to a particular role. When we are creating cluster role, when I bind that cluster role to a user, that is called as a cluster role binding. So when I do that binding, it grants the permission to cluster role to that particular subject. So you can do multiple namespace granting by using cluster role or cluster role binding. How do we implement RBAC, which is role-based access control, in our KubeATM cluster? So we would start with a namespace because we would be discussing about the role which is applicable on the namespace level, not on the cluster level. And we would have a user and we would set the user credentials in a way that particular user can only do confined set of actions on development namespace which we would be creating. So let's start with creating a namespace. You can create a namespace with create namespace and give the name of the namespace. You can list them by doing get on the namespace and you should find development namespace created. Rest of them were created the time the cluster was created. You can get the context of your cluster. This would allow you to check on which namespace or which cluster, all the authentication information which we have with respect to the different contexts which are existing in the cluster, that shows up. And always the current will be showing this asterisk symbol on the left hand side. So this is the name of the context. This is the cluster on which it is present. And this is the authentication info, and it is not having any namespace. That means it's on the entire cluster level. And this is the context which we are using for working with our cluster. We would be creating a user called devdan and we would assign a password. This is not needed, but a lot of the times people ask, where's the user, right? So user, as we had discussed, that RBAC doesn't have the way of authentication. It has only the authorization path, right? So either this user comes from the Active Directory or the LDAP server and all. Here for time being, because we don't have Active Directory and LDAP server, I am creating a Linux level user with user command. I'm saying user add, and here I'm saying the shell, for default shell would be the bash shell for this user, and the username is devdan. I have created a user named devdan, but I haven't set the password. So let's set the password with password command. Let's retype the password. Awesome. So this user is created. Now we would have to generate keys for the devdan user. CSR, which is a certificate signing request for devdan, that needs to be created. So these are not part of Kubernetes because we should have an authentication mechanism for the devdan user. We are doing this. So I am using OpenSSL to create a key for the devdan user, and that has got created. Here, if you see, it says that it is created. Now over here, if you see, I want to request a new key, and here it says that my subject is this CSR, the output is given to devdan.csr, and I'm giving the subject as well to whom I would be tying up. Let's do this. Here, if you take this command, it has to be entire command taken up like this. Okay, so let's do that. And it didn't understand the slash word over here, right? So let me correct that. You need to have the string in the same line, or else you give the slash and it goes to the next line. So let me pick the string and put it here. That should work. It gives an error, but it would have created a file, and that file is saved as devdan.csr. That's confirmed that it is created even though you have an error. And you see this too. There is a key and there's a certificate signing request also created. Now you will have to generate a self-signed certificate and use those keys and all that over here for the Kubernetes cluster to have authentication mechanism. So you have these keys on the cluster level that you are picking up, and you're saying that you are setting up a self-signed certificate. You're giving an expiry of 45 days. So let me quickly check this if this pastes properly, or else I'll write them one by one. Yeah, it's done. It's done properly. So here, this is the first line because it's a huge line, a command. We are dividing that into multiple lines and giving this is the second line, this is the third line. When you get the symbol, that means that the command would continue in the next line. Till here, it is non-Kubernetes work. Once you have the credentials, the keys, the certificates and all set, with kubectl config set credentials command, you are setting the credentials for devdan. And you are saying this is the certificate and this is the key for this particular user so that you can authenticate. So here for devdan user, we have set a client certificate and a client key. Now, because I have to use devdan context in my cluster, how my admin has a context when you did the config get context, you saw admin context like that. I'm creating a context for the devdan user. And what does this say? That I'm creating a context called as devdan context in this cluster, in this namespace for this particular user. And that context is created. You can list the context. We saw this, that you can do a get on the contexts which are existing. Now you should have 2, but still we are in admin context. If I want to switch to my devdan context, you can supply here like this, -- context is equal to name of the context. It will execute the command in that context. At present, I've created a user. I've set the credentials, I've created a context for him, and I've told that the context would be existing in the development namespace, but I've not given him any authority, any authorization to execute any of the commands. So that's the reason if you see there is an error. It says that devdan user cannot list resources like pod in the namespace development. So let's create a role and do a binding between devdan subject and the role and give ability or the permissions for devdan user to create some resources in this particular context of development namespace. So we would be picking up the role dev file. Let me quickly create and show you the content as well. So in this, you are creating a role. This is the API version in which role was announced. The metadata. Here metadata specifies on which namespace it is applicable. The name of the role is developer. And here it specifies the API groups. So we had learned that there are several API groups, right? Like how you have this API version, this belongs to this API group. Version 1, beta 1 group. Same way others are the normal version 1 group or apps group or extension group. When you give this empty one, it is the version 1.1 and rest of them have their own names. So in this API group, you can spin up resources, but not all resources belonging to this API group. Rather, whoever belongs to this role can only execute actions on deployment, replica, set, and pod. And what sort of actions? These are the actions in the verb section. List, get, watch, create, update, patch, and delete. So I can list deployment, I can get deployment, I can get pods, but I can't get a service output, right? It will say I'm not authorized to execute these. So here you have created that role. Let's see the role binding part of it. Let me quickly create the role binding and then show you how I did last time. Role binding is also created. I'll show you the created resources as well in a while. So this is the role binding. In the role binding section, we say which role is binded to which subject, right? So the name of the role binding, the namespace of the role binding, the subject is this user is devdan. And here, if you see the role reference, it says that this role is referencing the developer role. So now devdan belongs to developer role after this. And because developer role can list a pod, can create a pod, can delete a deployment, it would be able to do all the actions as well. So we have created this. You can do a kubectl get roles. And we have created in development namespace. So let's give that parameter. Developer role is created and role binding is also created. If you describe them, you would find much more details about it, that this user is added. Now, I would use devdan context and see whether I'm able to execute the actions on pod or on deployment, because last time I was denied to do it, right? So I'm setting the context of devdan, and this time I'm doing get pods. No pods are running, so nothing is there in the development namespace. It says, but let's do one thing. Let's set this context and run. Run would get create a pod. This time if you do, it shows that it is container creating state and it is running state. So now as devdan user in cluster, in only dev namespace, I can do a set of actions which are defined in the role which is attached to devdan user.